It's a pleasure to be at the CDDF conference, and I want to thank the organizers for this kind invitation. I'm going to be speaking briefly about some lessons learned from Acceleration in Pediatric Oncology program, both from an academic perspective, because I spent most of my career in academia, as well as from an industry perspective. As far as disclosure, I am currently an employee and have an investment interest in Sanofi. And I do want to point out that certain components of this lecture were originally presented at the Accelerate conference in 2017, but are still highly relevant today. So to set the stage, I think it's important to put the problem of childhood cancer into certain context. Using data from the US, but one can certainly apply this to high-income countries, we know the number of childhood cancers pale in comparison to the number of adults with cancers, but that doesn't really tell the story. Cancer remains the leading cause of death from disease in children. So despite all our progress, where almost 80% of children are long-term survivors, it still remains a leading cause of death from disease. In the US, 1 in every 330 Americans develops cancer before the age of 30. And today, 1 in 750 20-year-olds alive in the US is a survivor of childhood cancer. Quite importantly, however, more than half of children surviving childhood cancer have serious lifelong consequences of treatment. So when one asks me, why do we need new drugs for children with cancer? I think there are three pillars to that. We have to improve the cure rates. We have to diminish acute toxicity, which is substantial with current therapy, and minimize the risk for late effects. So let me talk about pediatric drug development, and it has truly become an interplay between industry partners, regulatory agents, and academic groups. So academic networks, both in the US, Europe, and other parts of the world, have a central role in the conduct of clinical trials, and certainly for any phase 3 trial and many phase 2 or phase 1 trials, academia is central to the conduct of this trial. Overlying this entire paradigm is the input of patient, parents, and advocates. So there have been a number of regulatory initiatives, and I think Dominic or Greg Riemann will be speaking about these later, but let me touch upon them very briefly. They began in the US, and then they followed in Europe, and there's been some back and forth in these initiatives. The first one was the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, BPCA, and this was a voluntary incentive, and it allowed for a 6-month period of extension exclusivity, and clearly has had an impact in pediatric diseases. The Pediatric Research Equity Act, which was a requirement, has had a more limited impact because historically, and I'll get back to this, most oncology drugs received waivers because the diseases where which drugs were indicated, breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, simply didn't occur in children. But this has most recently been followed by the RACE Act, Research to Accelerate Cures and Equity for Children. It is now fully enacted. It had about a 2-year rollout period. And in this case, it's not based on disease, but it's based on relevance of drug targets to childhood cancer. And it truly will minimize the opportunity for waivers. A very parallel series of initiatives has been enacted by the EMA called Pediatric Investigation Plans, and I'm confident you'll learn more about that as the afternoon goes on. What have these initiatives done? Well, without question, they've catalyzed discussion between stakeholders, especially academic childhood cancer networks and industry partners. Now, the early pediatric regulatory initiatives had a relatively limited impact for children with cancer. That is evolving, and the impact is becoming greater. And the most recent act in the US, the RACE impact, was only fully implemented last year. And so its full impact, I think, remains to be determined. But I want to focus on a specific issue. There was an interesting paper by my colleagues, Neil Schulman and Stephen Du Bois, looking at the timing of first-in-childhood trials of FDA-approved cancer drugs. And timing, I think, is central to discovery and advancing therapies. And what they found was that the time between the start date of the first in-human clinical trial, generally the first in adult trial, and the first trial eligible to enroll pediatric patients was a median of 6.5 years. So by definition, children, in essence, are lagging behind scientific advances by a median of 6.5 years. And there are a number of reasons for this that I'm going to discuss, but I think we can all agree that this is an unacceptable situation given the pace of discovery, the pace of science, the pace of drug development, that children should lag in taking part of those advances by 6.5 years. So the example I'm going to give you is from the most common childhood cancer, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And what you see is that acute lymphoblastic leukemia is truly a disease of children and adolescents. In fact, children and adolescents are about equal in number to older adults. So whereas most childhood cancers pale in comparison as far as incidence to adult counterparts, for ALL, that is not the case. In this case, children are the predominant population that are impacted. So here's a story I shared many years ago about a novel drug for patients with ALL. And this drug was, the data from the first in human trial was presented in adults in 2011. So efficacy data, showing significant efficacy data of this new drug, presented in 2011. Ultimately, the drug was approved for adults with relapsed cancer in 2017. And as Steve's paper highlighted, the first child enrolled was the same year. So in this case, it was more than 6 years between starting the adult trial, let alone presenting it in 2011, and starting pediatric development. And for all diseases where the numbers were no different, ALL is that disease. So how did we arrive at a point where a new drug reached regulatory approval for adults with ALL and pediatric trials were just starting? Well, I come back to this paradigm because it's an interplay between industry, regulatory agencies, and academia. And I think it's best to look at this example that I believe can extend to many examples as a system failure. So let me spend a few minutes discussing why I think the system failed, because there was not just one problem here. And it wasn't that people weren't doing their jobs, but the system, in my view, did not work. It failed. So I'll start with industry. And now I'm in this industry for the past 2 years, so I'm pointing the finger at myself. Now, in general, industry does not want to invest significant resources in pediatric development until there's a reasonable likelihood of regulatory approval for an adult indication. And this, unfortunately, has not been fully impacted by the incentives and the requirements. And realistically speaking, in many circumstances, industry seeks to minimize its financial investment for pediatric development. The reason for that is the business models are extremely difficult. All of childhood cancer are a constellation of rare and ultra-rare diseases. And to create a business model there has indeed been a challenge for industry. There have been some exceptions that I think can pave the way. But nonetheless, despite the advances we've made, despite the regulatory changes, there is not a true incentive to starting early. What about academia? Well, that's where I spent most of my career. I would ask, should there be a more robust push to get into the clinic faster? Because academia deals with outside funding agencies, often government agencies, it deals with industry partners, it deals with philanthropic partners. It's a complex mix of funding, and getting into the clinic can sometimes be met with unexpected hurdles. Should we start with simpler trial designs? Because so few studies can be conducted in certain populations, there is often an understandable push to learn as much as possible. That learning can create complexities. And there are times where perhaps we should be most focused on successful development of a drug, recognizing that we might not in real time be able to answer every question that's posed. And ultimately, can the efficiency of study development be improved? I think across the industry, across academia, the answer to that is going to be yes. Implementing solutions, however, is not trivial, but we need to improve the efficiency in which we develop drugs. And then I come to regulatory agencies. And here I would say the question is, are requirements too granular or too restrictive? The regulatory agencies are bound to meet certain requirements. The output of those sometimes can be requests that indeed are granular or restrictive. And as an example, I would raise a question, should pediatric oncology have a greater regulatory burden than medical oncology? And unfortunately, in certain circumstances, that is what has evolved. In fact, for example, in this case for childhood ALL, there was a requirement to define an optimal biologic dose versus the hurdle for medical oncologists, adults with cancer, a safe and effective dose. Don't get me wrong, that is not a misplaced goal. Understanding the optimal biologic dose is important. But should that be a hurdle where the burden is put almost exclusively on children? So I think there's room for improvement here as we try to align the true goal, finding a safe and effective drug, recognizing that additional learnings will follow. But there has indeed been progress. From a regulatory incentive and requirement, it has truly been a major catalyst throughout industry to build pediatric capabilities. I've been doing this for a long time. I began pediatric cancer drug development more than 30 years ago. And at that time, to even find someone in the industry who was willing to discuss drug development was a major hurdle. There is no question that the regulations and incentives have changed the landscape. And as I hope you'll hear later from Greg, race implementation, which has taken disease diagnosis off the radar screen and replaced it with the relevance of the target, I think is going to further drive improvements in capabilities with industry. Both Europe and the US are working to understand what each other is doing. They have regular cluster meetings between the FDA and EMA. And I think this ultimately is leading to better informed development plans. That's not to say that the two are going to be the same, and that can prove a challenge for industry. But there is frequent and regular communication, and I'm hopeful that will allow for better alignment of requirements. I think I've been doing this long enough to say that when we look at pediatric investigation plans at PIPs, when we look at pediatric plans from the FDA, my sense is they're improving over time. Regulatory agencies are learning from their past moves to how do we make it better? And to me, that gives us hope that they can continue to improve. And ultimately, I would say childhood cancer drug development is on the radar screen of virtually all big pharma and many biotechs. And being on that radar screen is essential to our advances. I want to now talk a little bit about a platform that originated with colleagues in Europe, but has now become international. And that is a platform that is rightfully named the Accelerate platform. So Accelerate is an international multi-stakeholder organization that's focused on improving and accelerating new drug development for children and patients with cancer. And it is a patient-centric organization. This is an organization that, in a remarkable way, has brought together not only industry partners, but has brought in academic experts, academic networks. It has brought in funding agencies, and equally, if not more important, it has brought in patient and family advocacy groups to begin to address this challenge at a global scale. And I'm going to return to why a global scale turns out to be necessary. But if you look at how it's grown, and it started in 2015, participation is now increasing. Both US and Canada, and now bringing on Mexico. Almost all of Europe has now expanded, and we're looking as well, of course, at Australia and Japan. This is continuing to grow. And this platform, I think, probably like no other, has all the people in the room when we discuss the problems. It's just not a subset. It's everyone who has a hand in pediatric drug development is at the table. They have a voice and solutions can be found. One function of the Accelerate platform is strategy forums. And so over time, strategy forums have rolled out looking at specific challenges to us. We know the story of anaplastic lymphoma kinase, ALK inhibition, which has remarkable activity not only for patients with anaplastic lymphomas, but also for a subset of children with neuroblastoma. And you can move down this list and you can understand why there were important questions, because for children, these were going to be ultra rare populations. And many companies had drugs in development. Clearly, we were not going to be in a position to study all the drugs being developed. We needed a prioritization. Industry needed direction. Regulatory agencies needed to hear from us. This evolved in studies for epigenetic modifiers, which may turn out to be an essential component of future treatment for pediatric cancers. And you can see how it has evolved, including cellular therapies, as well as tyrosine kinase inhibitors. For this upcoming year, we've already defined that RAF and MEK inhibitors will be a topic. But these forums bring together the stakeholders, industry that is focused on developing drugs, regulatory agencies, academic networks, patients and families. So hats off to my colleagues in Europe. They have brought together an international community to help with this problem. With all that said, there are still challenges and we have not found solutions. So there has been progress, but right now I would say there's little evidence that we're truly shortening the timeline between first in human studies and first in children studies. We need to do that. 6.5 years delay is not acceptable, and we don't truly have a solution for that. But the other thing to keep in mind, because we're dealing with rare and ultra rare diseases, is that a maximum in general of 2 phase 3 trials in any pediatric cancer, and sometimes there can only be 1 phase 3 trial, can be conducted globally every 4 to 6 years. We simply cannot conduct multiple phase 3 trials at the same era for children with cancer. So prioritization should be considered by all stakeholders to allow more rapid development of high priority drugs. Not all drugs are created equal. We need to prioritize, we need to decide as a global community which are moving forward. And in my view, the time we spend discussing phase 3 trial design prior to any pediatric clinical data being available are both resource draining and counterproductive. Now, I've seen some movement away from that. We're not an industry looking to get out of a phase 3 trial, but we have to recognize that the community has to prioritize what's the most important phase 3 question we can ask today. And we have to align that desire and that goal with our requirements. So moving forward, I think that clinical development of high priority new agents can be accelerated. Regulatory incentives and requirements both could and should be better aligned to meet the goal of expeditiously moving the high priority new agents into pediatric clinical development. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the additional presentations and our discussion later. Thank you.